Our first witness this morning is, as I told those who were here yesterday, anonymous. Indeed, both our witnesses this morning are anonymous. So let me tell you the order that applies in his case. He's witness 1387. It is ordered that the name and address of witness 1387, now he'll be known as Mr. A.N., that's Alpha November, Mr. A.N., to you and me, and any other identifying information, such as the witness's image or a description of their appearance, cannot be disclosed or published in any form unless express permission is given by me or by the solicitor to the inquiry acting on my behalf. Witness W1387 must be referred to only as Mr. A.N. This order remains in force for the duration of the inquiry and at all times thereafter, unless otherwise ordered, and I may vary or revoke the order by making a further order during the course of the inquiry. Mr. A.N., please.
Mr. A.N., your full name is known to the inquiry. Could you please repeat after me and take the book in your raised hand? I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Shall be the truth.
Shall be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
It may be in the course of your evidence that you refer to yourself or your former partner by name, and for the avoidance of doubt, although those in the room will hear those names during the course of your evidence and the evidence of the next witness, they are covered by the restriction order and are not to be repeated. You were diagnosed with severe haemophilia A as a baby.
Yes, that's correct.
And you were treated at the Birmingham Children's Hospital, initially with cryoprecipitate.
Yes.
Your statement explains that from about late 1974 onwards, you received cryoprecipitate at home.
Yes.
You were about 10 years old at the time. And was that partly for reasons of geographical distance from the hospital?
Yes, we lived about 25, 30 miles away, so we were deemed that we could go on home treatment. So my parents invested in a large deep freeze because cryo was quite a large commodity in those days, and we went from there. So,
what was the effect of your haemophilia and your need for treatment on your education as you were growing up?
Same old story really with severe haemophiliacs. I did miss quite a bit of schooling, both secondary and junior. I didn't do too badly, but I missed more than I should have done.
You record in your witness statement being told when you were relatively young, and this is before you were informed of your infection through blood products, that you wouldn't live past 35.
No, that's right. That was quite a common thing on the ward at the Children's Hospital. When we used to miss, if you were in there for more 2 or 3 days, then they would sort of try and give you basic schooling, and some of them were just the one nurse just said, well, you may as well just have a bit of a play, or because you're not expected to live between over 30, 35 years. So, I don't know what you. Looking back on it, I don't know how I accepted that, but yeah.
You said in your statement at some stage it made you resolve that you'd live till at least 36.
Well, yes.
But you also say you were made to feel like a burden to the NHS.
Yes, very much so, because you didn't seem to fit into one category or another. It was odd because you could sometimes walk about, so you weren't a disabled person, but you weren't. You fell between two stools, if you like. Even though haemophilia is a disability, were treated in a very strange way at the Children's Hospital. Very strange.
Now, you were first offered Factor VIII products in 1977. You'd have been early teens at that point.
Yes.
And you've said in your statement you think it was by Dr. Gillian Mann, but it could have been by Dr. Frank Hill.
Yes, it was one of the two.
And that was Factor VIII products by way of home treatment.
Yes.
Can you recall what your parents or you were told about any risks?
We weren't told of any risks, and I've confirmed that with my parents. All we were told is that this was a groundbreaking medical development.
And you said in your statement the impression was, or you were told that Factor VIII was the miracle cure that would solve all of our problems.
Yes.
Your parents weren't told of risks of infection, and you weren't, or they weren't, warned to look out for any adverse reactions to the treatment. You have also, I think, a recollection of being told by Dr. Hill that the products were sourced from the United States.
Yes, yeah, I do.
We can see a list of the products that you received. Henry, can we have 1387002, please? And we can see here particulars of blood products, batch numbers by month and year. And we won't obviously go through the detail of all the batch numbers, but we can see here the vast majority of the products that you received, with very few exceptions, were Armour Factor VIII.
Yes, that's
if
great.
we just look at the next page as well, please, Henry. We can see that continuing through 1981 through the 1980s. In 1981, you fell ill after you'd injected yourself with Factor VIII. What can you remember about that?
Not a great deal, really. This isn't the glandular fever incident.
No, this you've said in your statement. You think you subsequently learnt that you were infected with hepatitis B.
Yes,
at this time.
I don't actually remember a lot about that, to be honest. Other than I was ill, and that was it.
There are in your records, and you've recorded this in your statement, positive tests for hepatitis B surface and core antibodies for May 1981.
Yeah, it turned out to be, yeah.
Do you know whether you or your parents were told at the time that you were being tested for hepatitis B?
No, I've asked them this question and they no.
Were you told, or your parents told, that that you had in fact tested positive for hepatitis B?
No.
So in about early 1984, you fell ill with glandular fever.
Yeah.
And we just have up on screen, please, Henry, 1387010. We can see it's a letter from Dr. Hill, dated the 20th of January 1984 to you. I'm sorry to hear that you had glandular fever. Hope that you're beginning to improve. I presume this is why you couldn't come to my clinic today, and he offers further clinic dates. What do you recall about that episode of glandular fever?
It was quite worrying because I was planning to get married in the not too distant future, and it was a horrendous illness. And I'm although I've got severe haemophilia, I'm not ill usually, and I was bedridden with this. I do remember that our local village doctor came out, our family doctor came out and to see us. And he said to me, I'm diagnosing you with glandular fever, but I think you should see a specialist in haemophilia. And I genuinely believe he knew more than he was letting on, or wanted to let on professionally.
And the way you put it in your statement is that the GP said that this fever would have been triggered by something, and that there were some things that were above his knowledge or words to that effect.
That's correct, yeah.
With the benefit of hindsight,
yes,
you now think that's around the time that you were seroconverting.
Yes, because that just ties in with everything that we found out. So, and the amount of people who've had glandular fever when they were seroconverting is, almost 100%. So.
I think you didn't, in fact, go and see the Haemophilia Centre. No.
Certainly not Frank Hill. But there you go.
In 1984, you married.
Yes.
And your former wife will be giving evidence after you this morning. up to this point, apart from the illnesses you've described and apart from the obvious effects of the haemophilia that you've described, you were leading a busy, normal life,
Yeah. Yeah.
working, good social life,
Yeah.
looking
very
forward
good.
to marriage.
Very good, yeah. The haemophilia didn't really, it was just one of those things, you know. I just treated myself when I did, and that was it, so.
And I think you and your partner had bought a house together?
Yes, we did, yeah.
At some point in the early part of 1985, you had a urinary infection
Yeah.
and passed out.
Yes.
Can you tell us what you remember about that and what happened immediately afterwards?
Yeah. We'd only been married about a year, so couldn't drive. And my father picked me up. I was taken to A&E at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, the old Queen Elizabeth Hospital. And I was on a trolley, and a junior doctor came to see me, and he was stood there to my left, flicking through the notes. And he just turned around and said, this looks like HIV developing into full-blown AIDS. And that was it. So, and I was already laying down, but I was floored because I didn't even know what AIDS was anyway, really. And to be tested for it and then to be told that I was positive as such a casual thing, I didn't know what to do, what to say. So.
And as I understand it, you're not sure whether he used the words HIV or not, or
No,
HTLV3.
But I remember the word AIDS and full-blown, which, yeah, that's how it...
Now, there is no record of this in your medical records.
Apparently not, no.
But I think it's right to say that the records that you've got do not appear to be complete in any event.
No, they're not.
And you don't, I think, have your GP records either.
No, mysteriously they vanished in 1985, 84, 85.
The only record that we have, if we have up on screen, please, Henry, 1387013. Prior to August 85 is the UK HCDO records, and we'll just look at that briefly. We can see there it says date first positive, 28th of April 1985. And that would be consistent with your recollection of being given some information in the way you've described in the first part of 1985.
Yeah.
But it is right, I should point out, if we go to the next page, please, Henry. There's an obvious error on this page because it says date condition diagnosed, 1st of January 1999, and you've no idea, I think, where that date comes from.
No.
So the first reference in your actual medical records to HTLV3 appears to be August of 1985, the 1st of August of 1985.
Yeah.
And we'll just again look at a record in relation to that. 1387008, please. If we look down the very bottom of the page, we can see an entry for... It says married for 1 year, wife pregnant, and then it says this, HTLV3 status not known. And then there appears to be a further line under that, but this is the only form in which you have a copy of your records.
Yeah.
So we don't know what that further line might say.
No.
As I understand your evidence, you and your wife did go to see Dr. Franklin on the 1st of August 1985.
Yeah.
You went to see him, in part at least because your wife was pregnant.
Yeah.
And because you had this information from the accident and emergency admission that you might have AIDS.
Yes.
And you wanted to talk about that with Dr. Franklin. Yeah. Could we have up on screen, please? It's a document with a reference number for the next witness, Henry. So it's 1388002. So we can see the date is the 1st of August 1985, the date of that entry in your records, the date you went to see Dr. Franklin. It's a letter from Dr. Franklin, we can just about see that at the bottom, to Dr. Jones, who was your wife's GP.
Yes.
Not yours.
Yeah. No, he refused to have me.
And it says this, this 19-year-old girl who is the wife of a patient of mine who has severe haemophilia A came together with her husband to see me today. As you know, she's 3 to 4 months pregnant and would prefer to terminate the pregnancy. Any child of this union would be a haemophilia carrier if female, but hemostatically normal if a male. There would therefore appear to be no grounds for termination from the haemophilia point of view. However, the current concern amongst the haemophiliacs regarding the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, AIDS, has been causing us to modify our advice to haemophiliac patients who wish to undertake a family at the moment. Our present advice to these couples is that they should not have children until the infectivity of the AIDS virus has been clarified. We also recommend that all haemophiliacs use contraceptive sheaths for sexual intercourse, since it's well established that the AIDS virus is transmitted in semen. In the USA, there have been cases of AIDS being transmitted from AIDS patients to female sexual partners and also from mothers to newborn babies. Unfortunately, we've been so far unable to test, and then that's your name, to see whether he's been exposed to the HTLV3 virus in the past. I have today carried out the necessary investigations on himself and his wife, but these will probably not be available for some weeks. I would consider that, in view of the current nationally agreed advice given to haemophiliac patients, together with the likelihood of, and that's you, being positive for HTLV3 antibody, brackets 70% of our severe haemophiliacs are positive, close brackets, that the possible risks of transmission of the HTLV3 virus from you to his wife and hence to a fetus is sufficiently likely to represent grounds for termination under the Abortion Act. And then he goes on to say he's not the medical practitioner, not in a position to be a signatory, but he'll inform the doctor of the results of the HTLV3 testing as soon as these become available. Now, you and your wife didn't see this letter at the time. It was written by Dr. Franklin to Dr. Jones. But we can see the advice being set out there by Dr. Franklin.
Yeah. And that's August.
And that's the 1st of August 1985. You were tested after that.
Yeah.
We have the test result at 1387011. And we can see there, bottom of the page, the date that the sample was taken, 1st of August, and positive for antibodies to HTLV3, and the date stamped the 12th of August 1985. You did, I think, consent to being tested on this occasion when you saw Dr. Franklin.
Yeah.
And you and did go ahead with the termination.
Yes.
Based upon the advice that you were given. There's just 2 further documents to complete this sequence of events. Could we have up on screen, please, 1387012? It's the GP's response to Dr. Franklin, and we'll just look at the first sentence of it. It says this from a GP, 14th of August 1985. Thank you for your letter about Mr. That's you, A.N. I found your statements rather frightening. So the GP himself regarded what was being said as rather frightening.
Yeah.
Can
I point out in that letter, it says the problem is that I'm not registered. He wouldn't let me register with him. So it's, you know, these some of these letters are ridiculous. They really are.
And do you know why you weren't permitted to be registered with
Oh, yeah, he was quite open about it. It's because I was HIV. Very open about it.
You've then described in your witness statement being called back for the results of the test that we just looked at, the HTLV3 test. And you've estimated in your witness statement it was about 6 weeks later.
Yeah, thereabouts.
What can you recall being told?
It was quite a cold meeting. It was basically, you know, you've got this, and you have got approximately 3 years to live. There never ever seemed to be a start date from that 3 years. I could have been 2 years, 6 months down the line for all I knew. It was just, yep, that's it. Now go home. No. As cold as that, really.
There's no record in such medical notes as you have, as I understand it, of the follow-up consultation at which
No.
the test result was communicated to you. All we have is something from the following year, May of 1986, so we'll just look briefly at that. 1387009. We see the date first of May 1986, and then the last two lines, it says repeated advice through barrier contraception, and then advised HTLV3 positive. But you're confident, as I understand it, that you had been told that
Yeah.
in the aftermath of the August 85 consultation,
Yeah.
and not as late as May of 1986.
No.
Were you told anything when you went to see the doctors in the autumn of 1985, or indeed at any later stage, about whether you should tell other people or not about your infection?
It was pretty much don't tell anybody. He knew that we were a young married couple, and you just don't tell anybody. Not that we were going to anyway, because we still didn't know what this was. So,
And is going to be giving evidence about this, but you were, as you describe in your statement, very young, very frightened, and bombarded with information about the risks of AIDS.
Yeah.
And that really continued for the following years.
Oh, yeah.
You said in your statement that it was around this time there was a change, a shift in the atmosphere and workings of the Haemophilia Centre.
Very much so. I didn't go after this diagnosis. I very rarely went to the haemophilia unit. But what was very, very noticeable is you used to go into the waiting room, and there were many, many, many chairs, and it was full, always full. The clinic appointments that I had afterwards, there was just one or two people, or myself on our own, and that really struck out at us that what's gone on. It was just so odd, very, very odd. So, but I basically stopped going to the clinic appointments. The arrogance of the doctors that I was seeing, you couldn't ask them questions really. They just told you what they wanted to tell you, and that was it. So
it was some 10 years later, in 1995, that you found out that you'd been infected also with hepatitis C.
Apparently, yes.
And we'll have a document up on screen. It's 1387006. Helps us date this. So it's the 31st of March 1995. It's from Dr. Wild, who by this time was your consultant. And it says this. It says that you attended the clinic this morning requesting hepatitis C serological testing, having been prompted to do so by a communication from the Haemophilia Society. The blood test was duly performed, and he will be informed of his result. Now, the blood test was performed, and you were informed of the result, and it was positive.
Yeah.
But I think you don't believe this is a correct record of what triggered.
I don't. Anybody
testing.
in the room that knows me knows that I have little regard for the Haemophilia Society. I would not have taken. We would not have had any literature come through to us from the Haemophilia Society. Full stop. And if by any chance we did, it would have gone straight in the bin. So that does not ring true. Also, 1995. That's a very, very, very late date for Hep C. I just think that is a letter of convenience as far as I'm concerned. It ties everything up nicely for the records. So. And
you don't know why you weren't called in for testing in relation to hepatitis C earlier than 1995?
No.
So precisely what triggered the test, it hadn't been done prior to this year?
I don't know. But I hadn't sanctioned it if it was.
And you've said in your statement that having received the hepatitis C diagnosis at that time, it was the bottom of your list of things for you to worry about.
Very much so. I did get on with Dr. Wild, my haematologist, and I went there for I think it was a clinic appointment. It wasn't just for the results, but he actually said, I have the results of your Hep C. And I said, he said something like, do you really need to ask And I just shrugged my shoulders and said, no, not really. A bit further on in the consultation, I said about this Hep C, and he said, I wouldn't worry about it. You have to prioritise things, and your haemophilia is going to come above the Hep C, and HIV and AIDS is the top of your list. And that was it. I mean, it really didn't speak much about it then.
Now, in 2000, so 5 years after the hepatitis C diagnosis, you went on a treatment strike because you wanted to be on recombinant. Again, we'll just look at a letter to help put this in context. It's 1387005, please, Henry. It's dated the 19th of May 2000. It's a letter from you to Dr. Wild, and it says this: as you're aware, recently I sent a batch of Factor 8 back to the unit as I was not happy with its appearance. I read the letter from Grifols, the manufacturer, I'm afraid was not convinced. In their opinion, it may be within the colour ranges allowed, but there seems to have been no specific testing of this batch other than when it was packed for distribution. I know that you as a doctor cannot comment. I'm also aware that you cannot guarantee to me where the blood plasma contained in this product is from, only where it's manufactured. And then you say this: well, over the past few months, I've had less and less faith in these products, and I feel that at the moment I would rather risk severe bleeds than treat myself with something that I cannot wholly trust, especially considering the fact that I have already had my health severely compromised with 2 blood-borne infections. I'm sorry to be a difficulty to you as a patient, but I feel I must write to you and let you know of my feelings on this subject. The problem is only made worse for the fact that there is a synthetic product that is available to haemophiliacs, which could reduce the fear and risks of other infections drastically. You know that I have the greatest respect for yourself as my doctor, but I feel whilst I'm still prescribed human-based Factor 8, I would rather accept the problems with bleeds as a physical one rather than the anguish of injecting these products with the worry that it has now become. What can you recall about that?
That was a difficult time. I had a good friend of mine from up north who'd gone on a treatment strike, and he was quite ill. He shouldn't really have done it, but he did. And I felt very strongly about this because there were certain other viruses that had already been identified, parvovirus being one. Our immune systems had already been damaged. To expose them to any other virus was just ridiculous. You know, how can anybody do that? So a few of us stopped taking Factor 8, and that was it, basically.
And you, I think, wrote to and got support from Mark Winter.
Yes.
You can explain who that was.
Dr. Mark Winter was, I don't know where he was a haematologist, I think it was down south somewhere, but he was Macfarlane Trust trustee as well. And I asked him a statement. Would you agree with the fact that parvovirus can and is found in human-derived Factor 8? He said yes, and he also sent a supporting letter that I had to send to the Worcester Health Authority at the time because it came down to finances, and it didn't matter. This is the frightening thing. It didn't matter how efficacious Factor 8 was, the recombinant, compared to human-derived. It came down to cost, and that was it. Mark Winter actually put in his letter that I think it lasted slightly longer than the recombinant lasted slightly longer than human-derived anyway. So you would have to buy less. As soon as they saw that, we had recombinant.
And that was in the middle of 2000, we've seen, when you were writing, expressing your concern about
Yes.
what else might be in the products that you were injecting yourself with.
But I wasn't the only one, so...
But it was the very next year, 2001,
Yes.
when you received letters saying that you might have been exposed to variant CJD.
Yes, so somewhat proved a point.
And what was the effect on you of being told of the risk of that you'd been exposed to vCJD?
It was extremely concerning, actually. The hepatitis C hadn't given me any worries. I had HIV-related illnesses, quite bad ones. And I had our marriage had broken up by then, and I had to take on board that this CJD, which was similar to the way it was being treated as AIDS was in the 80s. There was a lot of shock, horror, media stories, and you weren't alive very long. Let's put it that way. But again, prioritise it. You know, I hadn't known anybody that had died of it that I know of. So
If we go back then to the second half of the 1980s, when you had been given the diagnosis of HIV, you were about 21 years old at the time. You were newly married.
yeah,
And you say in your statement that that diagnosis destroyed yours and your wife's lives and changed the course of those lives forever.
yeah. I think I've said to you, there were three people in the marriage, three individuals in the marriage, and one of them was this big virus, and it just ripped us apart. I was 18 when we got married. We wanted to buy a house, settle down, you know, do the things that normal people do, and not 12 months after, it was ripped apart, completely ripped apart.
Can I ask you first about the physical health impact of infection and treatment? What have been the predominant physical effects of the HIV infection?
From initially, not much. A lot of mental anguish, but initially not much physical. I had a lot of sort of little opportune infections that were all put down to being related to HIV. It wasn't until 99 that I had to go and see Dr. Wild because I had fell seriously ill, and that's when we had the conversation about antiretrovirals, etc. So.
And just before we get to that, you declined treatment
Yes.
with AZT.
Yes, I had.
Why was that?
Because some of the haemophiliacs I had seen, to me, they just look worse than the ones that weren't on AZT. I asked, I'm pretty sure it was Frank Hill, I asked about AZT, what it was, and I was told, well, there's no need for you to know, you just take it. That's the sort of attitude, which is why I stopped going. But I am glad I didn't take AZT. That's my personal choice, and I still think in some cases it should never have been given. But
And as you were just saying, it was around the late 1990s that Dr. Wild said to you, get treatment now or you'll be dead within 3 months.
yeah, I went to see him. I was very weak at the time. I had esophageal candida, which is a typical HIV-related illness. He did some bloods on me, and we had a chat. And I always asked him to be straight with me, and he said, "Look, you've never taken antiretrovirals. In my opinion, you've got about 3 months to live. So go home. Don't take too long to think about it. But have a think what you want to do." So I had to go home and have a think about it. So.
And you've described in your statement you were still unsure whether you wanted to start the medication or just let nature take its course.
Yes.
But you had a home visit from one of the haemophilia nurses, Sam.
Yes, Sam. Yeah. Yes, she was a rod to many of us, and she basically convinced me to give it a go. I think she said something like, "You can die later if you really want to." It's very very flippant, but that's the sort of relationship we had with her. So.
You did start the antiretrovirals, but the first set of drugs that you had caused significant problems. What were those?
I believe it was nevirapine. I was burning up, but I had massive rashes on the inside of my thighs. And I actually, once I'd started it, I thought, right, well, I'm going to carry on. Sam came round and asked me how I was getting on. I think I'd been on them a matter of weeks. And I said, "Oh, okay, apart from this rash." And I showed her the rash and she went ballistic. She said, you should have told me about this. Your body is rejecting it. So I was a little bit annoyed because I just thought it was one of those things. But I then got put on another drug, Delaverdine, which was named patient at the time, and was on that for years.
You've also said in your statement that you think that first drug regime led to you having a duodenal ulcer.
Yes.
Since that time, what have been the side effects of the medications as they've changed over the years?
Multiple ulcers, which I've been in and out of hospital. Touch wood. I hope that this has now been sorted. It's hard to put your finger on it really, because you just live with it every day. But appetites, tiredness. I was forever going to see the doctor about why do I feel so lethargic and tired and can't concentrate. I was always told, well, it could be the Hep C, it could be the HIV, it could be the meds for the HIV. We don't know. It's just been an ongoing thing, really. So,
one of the concerns you voiced in your statement about your medical care is that your HIV care remained in the hands of haematologists.
yes, it was a concern because they weren't HIV specialist doctors. However, with Dr. Wild, I preferred it that way because I could have an open chat with him about things, and we literally did muddle through together. That was a sentence when he retired that he came out with, and I'm still here. So he did all right by me.
You've said in your statement in relation to HIV this: it's true that today HIV is a treatable disease. This has not always been the case, and being diagnosed with HIV today is not the same as being diagnosed back in the 1980s, when there was either no treatment or only experimental treatment available. Some of the medications given at that time did as much harm, if not more, than the virus itself.
That's correct. And we were also, this is happening now, Truvada, which I was put on, which was named as the wonder drug only last year. There is now legal action in America for fatalities of people who have been taking it. I've been taken off it because of kidney results that started to fail, and numerous other people have in this country. And this was held up as a wonder drug only last year, so it carries on.
Hepatitis C treatment. You've said in your statement that sometime after 2005, you were referred to see a Dr. Mutimer,
Yeah.
and you underwent a fibroscan and
Yeah.
blood tests.
Yeah.
And you were offered pegylated interferon and ribavirin.
Yeah.
What was your decision in relation to that?
No. At that time, I'd been involved with Birchgrove, and we were receiving numerous letters from people who had been on this. I asked him, it was a loaded question. I asked him what the side effects were. I knew what the side effects were because I'd spoken to these people, and it was horrific. He came out with, oh, well, it's mild flu. But I challenged him about this, and the meeting did not go very well.
You also, I think, raised concerns about the interaction with
Yes.
your HIV medication,
Yeah.
and didn't get very clear answers.
Didn't get very far with that either.
And so you declined the treatment. At the time you wrote your witness statement, you were receiving reasonably regular liver function tests.
Yes.
But the question of further treatment was left open. What's the current position?
Now, as of this year, I have got chronic liver disease. There is scarring and fatty tissue. I am going back to see Mutimer in November, hopefully with a view to going on the latest medication, if we manage to have a decent talk about it. So,
How has the events that you've described affected your trust in medical professionals?
I have
in
no
the
trust.
NHS?
I have no trust. And as my partner will bear out, it's getting worse in the health authorities, especially with haemophilia. My life has actually been literally threatened, and that's not an exaggeration, is it? Twice in the last 3 years by one doctor asking me when I contracted haemophilia, and at this time I was in an accident emergency with severe internal bleeding, and it's just the list goes on. The list goes on.
You've described in your statement an incident in which you were in an ambulance. This was in
Yes.
2016. Can you
Yeah.
tell us about that?
That was a burst ulcer. I'd been vomiting and passing blood in large amounts. I felt very, very faint. Called the ambulance. I thought I was going to pass out, so I automatically, as haemophiliacs do, you reach for factor 8 because there's nobody else going to have it. I had a large dose of Factor VIII and sat on the bed. The paramedics, 2 young ladies turned up. We had a chat. They did blood pressures, etc. They wanted to send me to hospital. Took me down to the ambulance, and they were just sorting me out on the stretcher and everything. And I asked, "Where are you taking me?" And she said, "Warwick." And I said, "Well, I don't want to go to Warwick Hospital. I won't come out of there alive. And also, they won't want me." So she said, "Well, where do you want to go?" I said, "Queen Elizabeth." She put the radio, whatever it was, on hands-free, sat it there. She called through and said, "I've got a severe haemophilia with internal bleeding, blah, blah, blah. What should we do?" And he said, "Well, I'd rather you took him somewhere else." So she said, "Well, that's what we do." And they actually had a shift change midway. So we had to work out how to meet the other shift and change ambulance crews.
How has the risk of exposure to vCJD affected your medical treatment?
Quite drastically, and I think it's affected quite a few people and they don't know it. With the ulcers that I've had, there was one surgeon who ran the endoscopy unit, and I had to go there because this was at the start with a suspected ulcer for an endoscopy, and he came in and he said, "Oh, it's good news, you don't have to have an endoscopy." Well, I've always been a bit outspoken when it comes to doctors because you have to be. And I said, "Well, I'm not going anywhere until you actually perform an endoscopy because I've got an ulcer. I've had one before, I know what it feels like." We argued quite politely, but he bowed down and said, "OK, I'll give you an endoscopy." That came back with nothing, did it, apart from a hernia. Not long after that, I started vomiting blood. So I had another endoscopy, which they said, I think it was 10 o'clock in the morning. And I rang them up and said, "Are you sure it's 10 o'clock in the morning?" "Yes." "Why?" I said, "Because you don't usually get seen until after 4. "No, 10 o'clock in the morning." We got there at 10 o'clock in the morning and we weren't seen until after 4. And that's how it is. And I noticed that the endoscope in the blue bag at the bottom of the pile was... I sat and watched these other in the yellow bags being used, and the blue one was mine. I've spoken to a nurse, a good friend of mine, who's retired from the Haemophilia unit, and she told me that there was a memo, for want of a better word, sent out about the non-risk of CJD now on instruments, but certain doctors and surgeons were taking it upon themselves to actually still carry out procedures that took place a long time ago.
You do say in your statement that you've had brilliant support from your pharmacist in terms of assisting you to get medication for your ulcers.
Yes.
And for your dental care from the maxillofacial department at the hospital.
Yes. Yes.
I wanted to ask you next, if I may, about the effect of the HIV diagnosis on your marriage and your private life. You've described already how very young you were and what happened in 1985. In 1989, your wife was pregnant again. And we'll be hearing more evidence from her about this later this morning. But your witness statement records that when she went to the GP, she was told that the baby might well have HIV.
Yeah.
And you decided, the two of you, that she would have a termination.
Yeah.
And you've described this in your statement as something that was very much pressured onto a young, scared and ill-informed couple. Is there anything else you want to say about the decision-making in relation to that and what the doctor said to you?
Hindsight is a wonderful thing. We were just so frightened. We didn't get any proper advice whatsoever. We were literally just like rabbits in headlights, and it was more than advice about getting a termination. It was actually, we're leading you down this path, which we took.
And in terms of the day of the termination itself, you've recorded two details in your witness statement.
Yeah.
One is the biohazard warnings on the door of the room,
Yeah.
and the other is you effectively being required to leave the room.
Yeah, I didn't know half of what went through because I buried my head in the sand. I just shut it all out. But I've heard what she had to say, and I've pieced it all together now. That particular night when the termination was carried out, I was sat on the edge of the bed with her, and it was in a very small room, and I was told basically to leave in no uncertain terms, quite rudely, which obviously I'd got other things on my mind at the time, but I just thought that's quite rude. And that ties in with what you will hear say later, and I didn't know she'd gone through all that. I just didn't know.
And you've said that you and she never really discussed it again.
We never discussed it again.
Your marriage had been deteriorating since the
Yeah.
HIV diagnosis.
Yeah.
You had to give up work,
Yeah.
and she was caring for you and having to hold down numerous jobs.
Yeah.
And in the end, you separated.
Yes. Yeah.
And in 1999, after you'd separated, and we'll hear more about this later from her, but she found out that she was HIV positive.
She did. Yeah.
In terms of your career, you'd previously had jobs that you loved,
Yes.
and there was an exciting moment at which you were offered a fantastic job in the States.
Yes. Yeah.
But you had to turn that down.
I had to turn it down because I couldn't. At that time, it was difficult to get a travel visa, let alone a work visa. So that we never spoke about it. I had the job offer, and it literally got threw in the bin.
And you say in your statement that you not only lost out on a career, but the feeling of being useful in life.
Yes, very much so. Yeah, and you can never get that back. Yeah, you just being, whether it's the doctors or whatever, you are a disposable commodity that doesn't mean anything. And I think that's why a lot of haemophiliacs strive in whatever career they do to get to the top or be better than somebody who hasn't got haemophilia. I don't know. It's like a challenge, and so it's sort of it's worse to be knocked flat than if you hadn't had haemophilia. That's how I look at it, because we had the challenge of it anyway. So.
And you threw yourself into campaigning work, in particular your work with the Birchgrove group.
Yes, yeah.
You describe yourself in your statement as constantly in fear of the stigma attached to your infections, particularly in relation to the HIV.
Yes.
And I wondered if you could tell us about that.
Well, a lot of people say that there is no stigma to HIV anymore. In London, no, there isn't. And most big cities, probably not. I live in a small village, and I tell you now, if I walked in the pub with a red ribbon on, I dread to think what would happen. It's still the same. There is still the same stigma. Maybe not as violent or as vicious, but there is a lot of stigma around HIV and AIDS, and a total misunderstanding of haemophilia and HIV, even today.
You've referred in your statement to, because of the known association between haemophilia and HIV and AIDS, you began to downplay the fact of your haemophilia or not tell people that you were a haemophiliac.
Yeah. From my teenage years, I rode scooters, and all my friends knew I was a haemophiliac in case I'd had an accident. And I stopped telling anybody that I met because haemophilia just equated to AIDS. And I think I did put it in my witness statement because, again, it's sort of gallows humour, but I was on a rally in, I think it was Great Yarmouth, and a friend of mine shouted across, "Oh, you're one of those necrophiliacs, aren't you?" And I actually preferred being called a necrophiliac to a haemophiliac. That's how bad it was.
You say in the 1980s and 1990s, the fear about AIDS was overwhelming.
Yeah.
And there were horrible jokes
Oh, yeah,
everywhere.
yeah, yeah.
And you'd pretend to laugh along.
Yeah, you'd be sat in a pub and, even the crowd of my good friends would tell AIDS jokes, and I would just have to sit and laugh. You know, you have to be the third person and remove yourself from that. And some quite horrific things when Rock Hudson died and all that sort of stuff. It was terrible, and I think a lot of this mentally has never been looked at. All of the attitude towards haemophiliacs and AIDS has never. And I closed the door, and that was it. We shut the world out. We didn't buy newspapers. We didn't watch the news because it was just terrifying, absolutely terrifying. And then I go out with my friends, and it's reinforced that attitude is there. So.
And you're still to this day very selective about
very selective.
who you tell.
Yeah.
You've said in your statement that the village you live in isn't a place in which you would even say the word HIV.
No.
And you also describe how there have been occasions where you've been in hospital and a ward sister might call out in front of other patients, your HIV meds are ready.
Yeah, I think that was when I had my ankle done. And they take your meds off you when you go in, which I've got a problem with to start with because you need to take them at set times. And these times never fall in line with when they come round with the medicine trolley. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I was on a public ward and the nurse shouts, I have your HIV meds for you. Shouldn't happen.
Over the years from 1985 onwards, what support or counselling, psychological assistance has been offered to you?
None.
You say in your statement there are no drop-in sessions, no support, no counselling made available. And the only assistance that you've had are from individuals such as nurses at the Haemophilia unit, Mark Simmons, the social worker attached to the unit, and you've also referred to a benefits advisor from the Macfarlane Trust. So some individual pockets of assistance. But
she was brilliant. She turned my life around. I was in a very dark place. I'd got no money coming in. I didn't want to fill out any forms or anything. I just couldn't cope. And she, I don't think they do it now, but I was awarded a DS 1500, which means sort of imminent death. I think it's death within 12 months or something. Obviously that didn't happen, but she within a couple of days she turned it all around for me. So.
You were involved in the 1991 HIV litigation. And you recall having to sign a waiver.
Yes.
What were you told? What were the circumstances in which you signed that?
We were basically told, if you don't sign it, nobody else will get the money. And that was it. That was basically, I think it was at the office, the solicitor's office. And we just signed it. That was it.
You spoke to a solicitor about seeking financial advice after the payment had been received. What was the response?
Basically turned round and he said, "Why would you want to? You know, you're going to die fairly quickly. Go out and enjoy it." Again, for the solicitor to be saying that, because I still didn't believe that this was going to happen. I felt healthy. I was young, but obviously it was going to happen. So we did.
You were also involved in US litigation.
Yeah.
Against the pharmaceutical companies in the States. And you have a memory of flying out to the States and giving evidence or giving a deposition.
Yeah.
We've got a record of some of what you said, but you have a recollection of being asked other questions.
Yes.
Can you tell us what your memory is of the kind of things that you were asked about?
If I'd had gay relationships, was I an intravenous drug user? These were implied that I was an intravenous drug user. When you read the deposition, I don't think it does justice to how we were treated over there. You were almost a guilty party. I also do you want me to tell about the blood transfusion side of it now? That was after the gay sex and the intravenous drug use. Apparently, there was an entry in my medical notes that said that I'd had a blood transfusion. Well, ironically, I hadn't. And I know I hadn't because I'd only had one transfusion up until then, and that was when I was 12 months old. So my lawyer was trying to keep me quiet, and she didn't want me to say anything, but I was just so disgusted because it was a false statement that was entered into my records.
And the purpose of the question, as you understood it
Yeah.
at the time, was to try and suggest that there was a
was
source of
another route.
infection
Yeah.
other than the American
Yeah.
pharmaceutical products.
Yeah.
And it's that memory that led you to say in your statement that
Yeah.
you think there were things in your medical records
Oh, definitely.
that were not true.
Yeah.
You're not talking about the records that we've seen, but records that you haven't been able to locate.
No.
I'll ask you about the Macfarlane Trust. First of all, your direct experiences in making applications. You applied after the breakup of your marriage
Yeah.
for a grant to do some basic work to your house.
Yes.
And you were offered a loan, and
Yeah.
that was put as a charge on your house.
Yeah.
And as I understand it, when you and your new partner then purchased a house, the charge was transferred over.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah.
It was then when the Macfarlane Trust ceased to exist, was wound up, that charge was transferred to the Terence Higgins Trust.
Yes,
And we've
without
heard that
our
from other
knowledge,
witnesses,
yeah.
without your knowledge. Do you know what's happened to that charge now?
I believe that the charges have been dropped, for want of a better phrase. Yeah, I think there was 9 registrants altogether, and I believe that now they have been removed.
You have said in your statement that you were for, at some stage, a trustee of the Macfarlane
Yes.
Trust. What can you tell us about the trust from that perspective?
Not very good things. It seemed that they always wanted to bring people down to a level, not raise them up to a level. There's very little empathy with HIV or AIDS-related conditions, what people were going through. It was just not fit for purpose. There were 2 of us that were infected haemophiliacs and worked as trustees, and there was definitely a trustee board within a trustee board, and we weren't part of that. Some of the decisions that were made, although they were supposed to be throughout the board, we were never consulted. This happened without us. And some of the... I sat on the NSSC, which was the grant making, and I use that term loosely. I'll bring one example up which proves the mentality. At that time, you had to send pictures in if you wanted things like your windows replacing for damp or whatever. And a lad had sent in a picture of a bay window which was completely rotten. Photograph got passed round, open and shut case, windows are rotten. A particular individual pointed out, well, he can afford a PlayStation and a packet of cigarettes, can't he? Now, a lot of individuals, when they were diagnosed, especially young individuals, never left their house. They lived on a computer. They lived a different life. So it just proved that there was no understanding there whatsoever, at all. And I don't believe he got the grant. So, but that's just one example.
You have given, I think, 2 examples in your statement of decisions of the EIBSS that you, not decisions personally in relation to any application by you, but that you, through your campaigning or Birch Grove activities, have had some knowledge of. One was about a member of your group, the Birch Grove group, who was taken in on holiday.
Oh, yes.
What can you recall about that without mentioning any names?
No. No, he'll mention his own name. Yeah, he was taken ill on holiday, and there was a shortfall in holiday insurance, and they basically refused to pay. And it was £100 odd, something like that. They refused to pay because it was HIV related. And again, it's all sorted now, that HIV thing, it's all gone away. The other was a funeral grant. If you have got Hep C, you can get a funeral grant, but HIV is nowhere on the list, and people are still dying of HIV-related conditions.
There's a passage or a couple of passages in your witness statement that I was just going to read out with your agreement, where you try and describe what the effect overall has been on your life of the events you've described. And you say this: "From that brief time in 1985, my life, both physically and mentally, have never been the same. How can it be? I can only speak from my perspective as a man of 20, just married, with my whole life ahead of me, with my new wife, who wanted to grow old, to become a parent, a grandparent, and then to find out in that way that it wasn't to be. From that day on, nobody can ever be the same. We carried on not telling anybody for fear of what may happen. We'd see AIDS scum on the news, on the TV, and sprayed on walls, and think, luckily, nobody knows about us. But we were still afraid of coming home and finding that written on our house or car, as many others did." You say this isn't over. The mental and physical anguish goes on. The gallows humour of who will be the last one of us standing hides what we all fear and have feared for many years. Our lives ripped apart by this, and then even further infections in following years, and yet we are okay according to medical sources. And then you say this: "Those of us alive who are walking and breathing can hold conversations about normal daily things, but the viruses are always lurking in the background. Nobody who hasn't been in our position could ever understand, and that isn't meant as a sympathy statement, it's a fact." Those are the questions I have for you. But before I ask you what else you would like to add, I'm just going to ask Mr. Snowden if there's anything else he would like me to ask. No. What else would you like to say?
Just a couple of sort of angry, bitter points that I usually bring up. I think our community has been let down historically by the Haemophilia Society, who pushed Factor VIII at a time when haemophiliacs were dying in America. They carried on pushing the fact that we should use Factor VIII more and more and more. After that time, they vanished from the community. There was token gestures, but they didn't want anything to do with the HIV community, and it disgusts me, really does. When I worked on a Birch Grove, the individual that ran the society at the time used to pay us as Birch Grove to cover any HIV-related stories, so the Haemophilia magazine didn't have to cover it. That's what they didn't want to frighten off the newly diagnosed haemophiliac children, etc., etc. And also with the ties with the pharmaceutical companies. That's one thing that I really hope that this inquiry brings out, the in-depth links with the society. Also the mattress, which we've spoken about. Again, I think that all the trusts warrant their own inquiry. And again, the thing we touched on is I do believe that haemophilia, whether it is infected, co-infected, whatever, people need more education through the hospitals about haemophilia. They haven't a clue. And in an emergency situation, haemophilia will kill you in a short amount of time. And this knowledge seems to have vanished over the last 10 years. I think that's about all I've got to rant on about, really.
Thank you. Sir Brian.
Well, rant on you certainly haven't. Can I just ask you a question? In one of the passages of your evidence, you described how you were quite argumentative at times, and you added this: you have to be with the medical profession.
Yes.
Can I just explore how far that goes? Because you've said quite a lot of very positive things about nurses,
Yes.
about social workers, about the professions allied to medicine.
Yeah.
So by medical people, you mean who? Doctors?
Yeah, clinicians and surgeons. Even to this day, we found an air of arrogance to certain individuals. Not all, but certain ones. I mean, for example, all of my haemophilia nurses have retired and left because they couldn't take it anymore. And they helped me historically, and many others in this room, over the years, beyond the pale, literally beyond the pale.
So you saw a tension between them and the medical staff?
Yes, very much so. And I believe that carries on now without mentioning any names, because there are a couple that are still in post. They try and do their best for us, and there's just no urgency for anything other than the nursing staff to do anything for us. And that's a haemophilia thing, that's not a HIV thing, that is a haemophilia problem.
And do you have any insight from actual experience, as opposed to from opinion, as to why the medical staff relate to you in that way when others in the clinical field don't?
Again, I think it harps back to when I was young and you just feel like you're a disposable commodity. You are neither one thing or the other. You know, you are looked upon, you can walk in, but you are a disabled person, and I don't know what goes on in their mind, but we have certainly come across arrogance in the last few years, beyond belief, and it should really stop. You know, we live in a different time now, which is probably going to be one of the arguments for the doctors a few years ago that infected us. But there's a lot of education that needs bringing forward about haemophilia and that sort of illness, really. You know, I can only talk about haemophilia. No doubt other people are worried to death about thrombosis or whatever, how they're treated, and the knowledge behind that.
Well, thank you very much for that. And thank you in particular for coming and giving your evidence. From what you've said, that you have explained very clearly, as I see it, the tension between being very apprehensive about saying anything at all. You put it that you're very selective about who you tell. You, in those last few extracts that were read to you about how the stigma has affected your life, you explained exactly why you wanted to keep everything quiet. And yet you've got the desire to be useful in particular, to tell people, to communicate, to educate, and the two pull in different directions. You've certainly, your giving evidence has been much more of the latter than the former, although I know it's been a struggle for you to bring yourself here, and I'm very much appreciative of that.
But I do believe that this has to be the end. This inquiry. Many of us have campaigned for years and years and years in this room, and we've come so close, and we've had 2 inquiries that have just been utter whitewashes, and we've had to step up again and try and see justice this time, and that to me is what it's all about. I have spoken to you, obviously, and what I want to see is criminal charges. That's my goal, and that's Birchgrove's goal, but we will see. I know the inquiry hasn't got the teeth to do that, but
no, the inquiry has no. I have no power, no right to determine criminal liability. Yeah. I am able, I think, and if I find it, I will say that fault occurred.
Yeah.
But that's rather different.
Yeah.
But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, we'll take a break until 20 to 12. 20 to 12.